The worst Thanksgiving of my life started with a casserole dish and a smile I hadn't seen in 2 years. My name is Evelyn. Well, that's what most people call me, but the folks at First Baptist in Cookeville, Tennessee still call me Miss Evie, the way they have since I started teaching Sunday school there back in 1987. I'm 63 years old. I have a bad knee, a good garden, and until recently I thought I understood my own son. I want to be very clear about something before I say anything else. I loved my son more than I have ever loved anything on this earth. I need you to hold on to that, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you wonder. It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving when he called. 2 years. That's how long it had been since we'd spoken more than a sentence or two. 2 years since the last real conversation, which had ended with him hanging up on me after I said something he didn't like about his wife. Something I won't take back because it turned out to be true, but we'll get to that. His name is Wesley. No, wait. I need to stop. I've been calling him by his name in my head for so long that it still comes out automatically. He's my son. That's how I'll say it. My son called me on a Tuesday at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I was watching the Channel 5 weather forecast and they'd just gotten to the extended outlook for the holiday weekend. "Mom," he said. One word. That's all it took to make my chest go tight. "Hi, baby," I said. I couldn't help it. He could call me after 10 years and I'd still say hi, baby. He asked if he could come for Thanksgiving. He said he wanted to try. That was the phrase he used, try. Like reconciliation was an experiment. Like I was a new medication he wasn't sure would agree with him. I said yes before I'd finished processing the question. My daughter-in-law, I'll call her what she is, did not come with him. He said she was visiting her own family. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I was afraid that if I looked too closely at the gift it would disappear. He arrived Wednesday evening around 7. I'd made a pot of chicken and dumplings because that was always his favourite, the real kind, with thick dough, not the flat noodle kind his daddy's side of the family tried to pass off as the same thing. He walked in with an overnight bag and a foil-covered baking dish, and he looked thin, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. We hugged for a long time. He didn't pull away first, neither did I. He set the baking dish on the counter and said he'd brought something for Thanksgiving dinner, a sweet potato casserole. He said his wife had made it before she left as a peace offering of sorts. He smiled when he said it, a little awkwardly, and I smiled back, and neither of us mentioned that she had never once, in 7 years of marriage to my son, offered me anything resembling peace. I put the dish in the refrigerator and sat at the kitchen table and talked until past midnight. Really talked, the way we used to when he was in college and would call me on Sunday nights. He told me things had been hard, that the marriage wasn't what he'd hoped, that he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He didn't say anything specific, and I didn't push, because we were just getting back to each other and I didn't want to rush it. When I went to bed that night, I cried a little, happy tears mostly, or what I thought were happy tears. Thanksgiving morning I got up early the way I always do, made coffee, fed the cat, stood at the back window watching the yard. The dogwood out there had already lost all its leaves, but the shape of it against the grey November sky is something I never get tired of looking at. My husband planted that tree the year our son was born. My husband has been gone 11 years now, and that tree is the tallest thing in the yard. My son came downstairs around 9. We cooked together. He peeled potatoes while I worked on the turkey, and it was so ordinary, so blessedly ordinary, that I had to keep turning away to compose myself. Around noon I pulled the sweet potato casserole out of the refrigerator to let it come to room temperature before baking. I peeled back the foil to check it and something made me stop. I don't know exactly what. It looked fine. The orange filling, the marshmallow top, all of it looked exactly right. But there was something about the texture in one corner that seemed slightly off, slightly grainy, in a way that sweet potato casserole isn't usually grainy, and there was a faint smell I couldn't identify. I told myself I was being foolish. I covered it back up. But I kept thinking about the 2 years of silence. I kept thinking about the fact that my daughter-in-law had made this dish, specifically this dish, to send along as a peace offering, when she couldn't be bothered to come herself. I kept thinking about how my son had lost weight and looked like a man carrying something heavy. And here is where I made a decision that I am still turning over in my mind. I did not throw the casserole away. I should have. I know that now, and I knew it somewhere deep down even then. But instead I told my son that I'd already committed to bringing a dish to my neighbour's Thanksgiving. That I'd forgotten, I said, that she was having people over and I'd promised weeks ago, and I'd completely blanked on it until just this minute. He looked at me. Something crossed his face. I can't tell you exactly what it was. Relief, maybe, or something trying to look like relief. Of course, he said, we have plenty of food. My neighbour's name is Paulette. She's 71, a retired school librarian, and she has more people in and out of her house on any given holiday than most people see in a month. I walked over with the casserole and told her it was homemade, from my son's wife, Sweet Potato. Paulette said wonderful and set it out with everything else, and I went back home and told myself I'd done the sensible thing, that I hadn't thrown away a dish of food based on nothing but a smell I couldn't even name. Dinner was good. My son had 2 helpings of turkey. I watched him across the table and tried to read his face the way mothers do, the way we never entirely stop doing even when our children are grown men in their 30s. He seemed lighter than he'd been the night before, more relaxed. After dinner we watched football. I don't care about football, but I sat beside him on the couch anyway, and that felt like enough. He left Friday morning. We hugged again at the door and he said he'd call. I said I'd like that. He drove away and I stood on the porch longer than I needed to. The call from Paulette came Saturday afternoon. Her grandson answered her phone, which told me immediately that something was wrong, because Paulette always answers her own phone. He told me she was in the hospital, that she'd gotten very sick Thanksgiving night. Severe stomach cramping, vomiting, her blood pressure had dropped. They'd taken her by ambulance around midnight. I sat down on the edge of my bed. I asked him if anyone else who'd been at dinner was sick. There was a pause. He said a few other people had gotten a little ill, but nothing like Paulette. She had eaten more of everything, he said, and she'd especially loved the sweet potato casserole. She'd had 2 large servings. I hung up and sat very still for what felt like a long time. Then I went to my son's room. He'd slept in his old room, and I hadn't changed the sheets yet, and I sat on the edge of his bed. I don't know what I was looking for. I don't know what I thought I would find. I just needed to be in a space that still held some trace of him. I noticed his closet door was slightly open. He'd borrowed a belt from the closet, which he sometimes did because he and my husband had worn the same size. The closet light was on, and the door had swung a few inches, and from where I was sitting I could see something on the floor in the back corner. A small glass bottle, dark glass, the kind that looks like it belongs in an apothecary or a very old medicine cabinet. I went to the closet slowly. I crouched down and looked at it without touching it. The label had been partially torn away. What remained said something about concentration levels. There was a skull printed below the remaining text. I stood up and went to the kitchen and called the non-emergency police line. My hands were not shaking as much as I thought they would be. I think sometimes, when the worst thing you've been trying not to think happens, there's a strange calm that comes with it, like your mind was already there, and your body just hadn't caught up yet. An officer came within the hour. I showed him the bottle. I told him about the casserole. I told him about Paulette. He was very professional, very calm, and he took the bottle in an evidence bag and told me not to touch anything else in the room. That same afternoon I learned that the hospital had already flagged Paulette's case. The attending physician had ordered a toxicology panel because her symptoms were unusual, not consistent with standard food poisoning. They had already been looking into what she'd eaten. The next several days were a blur. There were more officers. There was a detective who came to my house twice and asked me questions I hadn't expected, careful questions about my son's finances, about the house I lived in, about whether there was a will and who was in it. I sat with that. I have a house in Cookeville, Tennessee, that my husband and I paid off in 2009. It isn't worth a fortune, but it is worth something, and it's mine, and my son is the only person named in my will. His wife's family had money. I'd always known that. But they'd cut her off, or so my son had told me once, 3 or 4 years ago, quietly, like it was something he was ashamed of. Her family had cut her off over something he wouldn't explain, and since then they had been living on his salary alone, which was a teacher's salary, which is what it is. My daughter-in-law had made the casserole. My son had brought it to my house. My son had watched me take it to Paulette's, and then he had gone home. I called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Mom," he said, the same way he'd said it 2 weeks ago. One word. Except this time it didn't make my chest go warm. I told him the police had been to my house. I told him about the bottle they'd found in his closet. I told him Paulette was in the ICU. There was silence on the line. Long silence. Then he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He said it quietly, without heat, and somehow that was worse than if he'd shouted. "I think you do," I said. More silence. "She told me you'd never eat it," he finally said, so quietly I could barely hear him. "She said you never ate anything with marshmallow on it. She said you'd bring it somewhere. You always bring things somewhere." I have not been able to fully explain what it feels like to hear your child say something like that. There are no words in any language, I think, that would do it justice. It is not like any other kind of pain I have ever felt. It isn't hot like anger. It isn't cold like fear. It is something else entirely, something that lives below all the other feelings, something very old and very quiet. "She planned it," I said, not a question. "Mom, did she plan it?" He didn't answer, and his not answering was its own kind of answer. I asked him if he had known what was in the casserole when he brought it to my house. He said he hadn't known exactly. He said he hadn't asked. He said that in some ways he had not wanted to know. He said his wife had told him it was time, that we needed a fresh start, that this would solve everything, that those were the words she had used. "This will solve everything." I asked him what she thought everything was. He said the house, my will, the life insurance policy from when his father died, that she had found out about it somehow, that she had been the one to bring it up, that she had a plan, that she had been planning it for a long time. "And you went along with it," I said. "I didn't." He stopped. I didn't stop it, which is not the same thing as not going along with it, and we both knew that. I told him that I loved him. I said it plainly, without drama, because it was true. I told him I had loved him from the moment he was born, and that I would carry that love for the rest of my life, and that it would never change, not in the way you might expect it to change after a conversation like this. And then I told him I needed to hang up. He was arrested 3 days later. His wife had already been brought in for questioning. The toxicology report had come back. The bottle from the closet had been tested. Paulette spent 11 days in the hospital. She is home now, and she is recovering, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that, and guilty in equal measure. My daughter-in-law's attorney is arguing that my son was coerced, that he was in a controlled situation, that she had manipulated him over years. Maybe that's true. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge. I'm a 63-year-old woman in Cookeville, Tennessee, with a dogwood tree in my yard and a cat named Biscuit and a son who did not stop something terrible from happening to me. I go back and forth the way I expect I will for years. Some days I think about the little boy who used to climb into my bed on Sunday mornings and press his cold feet against my legs. Some days I think about the silence on that phone call. Most days I think about both at the same time, which is maybe the most honest way to think about it. A woman from my church came over last week and sat with me at the kitchen table and said, "Evelyn, how are you holding up?" I told her the truth. I said I didn't know yet, that I was still in the part of the story where you don't know how it ends, that I was trying to take it one day at a time, which is a phrase people say so often it starts to sound hollow, but turns out to be the only real advice available when the unthinkable has happened. She held my hand and we sat there for a while without talking, which was exactly what I needed. I am not telling you this story for sympathy. I want you to know that. I'm telling it because I know I'm not the only one who has sat across a kitchen table from someone they love and felt the first cold edge of the thought that something is wrong and talk themselves out of it. I know I'm not the only one who has chosen to believe the best because the alternative was unbearable. Trust that feeling, the one that makes you pause at a casserole dish at noon on Thanksgiving Day, the one that says, "Look closer, I wish I had."